Hello, church. Welcome to Exodus 31, 32, and 33. I want to invite you to a place to enjoy the presence of Jesus in these chapters. In chapter 31, we're introduced to two guys whom the Lord calls by name, Bezalel and Oholiab, and he gives them gifts to accomplish what only they could do to help Moses fulfill his calling. This is similar to how God calls us in the New Testament, and you'll even notice in verse 3, he gave Oholiab and Bezalel those gifts by the Spirit of God. And in 1 Corinthians 12, we know that we today have spiritual gifts also given to us by the same Spirit, and we need to work together as a body to accomplish God's will in a very similar fashion as they did here. Think about this, church. 1 Corinthians 12 says that the Holy Spirit has given each one of us a spiritual gift. You could ask the Lord this question today: am I using my spiritual gift to connect and serve others for your kingdom? That would be a precious thing to park on. If you go to chapter 32, you'll see a famous story here about the golden calf. And in short, what is happening is that, remember back in Exodus 24, we mentioned that Aaron and his company of comrades there were halfway up the mountain, and Moses told them to stay there, but obviously they didn't, because they're back down at the bottom here. And what is Aaron doing? Aaron essentially is letting himself, his nature take over, maybe his sinful nature, if you will, take over, and he's beginning to do whatever feels good to him. In verse 6, you'll recognize they're even indulging in pagan revelry, which probably includes sexual immorality of some kind. And there's this wild, unlimited party going on. But then it's like Aaron recognizes, oh, but we're saved by the Lord, so let's just throw the name of the Lord on this golden calf. And now let's just pretend that this is the Lord. And you can see that in verse 5, he names that calf the Lord. And I wonder, this kind of thing, we are prone to do the same thing today. In 2 Timothy chapter 4, for instance, it says that in the later times, people are going to gather around themselves a great number of teachers to say what their itching ears want to hear. Very much what's happening here in Exodus 32. How do we guard against that, church? Very simply, if we don't want to fall into this place, we can guard against that by discovering who God is in his character, by reading the Bible. We can find out ways to live that please him by studying the Bible, and we can engage with the Lord and have a relationship with him in prayer accordingly. That's how we guard against that, church. And then if you get into chapter 33, let me point out one quick thing in the end of 32. This is the little golden nugget. In verse 32 of chapter 32, Moses has this incredible love for a rebellious people. He's acted in very distinct truth, but he's got this incredible love where he wishes he could change places with these people if that were possible. Paul said there's a similar thing in Romans chapter 9. And here's the thing, my heart doesn't naturally want that for rebellious people. My heart is not prone to love people that way, but Jesus' heart is. And so then I have to recognize whose heart is reflecting God's heart. And then I could ask this question or petition the Lord and say, Lord, would you help me to reflect your heart and have your love for other people, even if they're rebellious? And then in chapter 33, that whole chapter is about the presence of the Lord. In verse 3 and 4, these people are mourning at the thought where God essentially offers them the promised land, but not together with him. And they mourn that thought because it's all about his presence. They're used to his presence. We see in verse 7 and 8, they were able to go to the tent of meeting and inquire of him at any time. They're used to going there. They're used to seeing the pillar of cloud. Moses is used to speaking with him. We see that in verse 9. And Moses even gets to this place where he recognizes in verse 15 and verse 18, he says, if your presence does not go with us into the promised land, do not take us up from here. In other words, he would rather stay in that hot, dry, dusty, hungry place of lack than rather have the gift of God over there, this blessing of God, but void of his presence. It's all about his presence and wanting to see his glory. And so we could ask ourselves that same question today. Do I value God's presence and his glory so much in my life today that I would prefer to rather go through a dry season in my life and maybe even put up with some hardship, but include the Lord's presence? Or would I actually like to go without his presence and just have one of his, maybe a blessing from him? And so if you wanted to ask that in a kind of an interesting way, you could ask this question: do I value God's presence, or do I value God's presence? Moses reflected God's heart and valued his presence and his glory. Tell the Lord that you desire that same thing today. Enjoy your day with Jesus, church.